Hey everyone, so today we're going to do a retrospective of Zoro and Sanji throughout the series to determine whether Zoro is supposed to be portrayed as stronger than Sanji, and if so, by how much. Are they supposed to be somewhat neck and neck, or is Zoro a lot stronger? I talked in my previous video on Zoro and Sanji about how a metric that people often use in this discussion is Luffy, and that's what I'm going to be using here. If Luffy is the strongest, Zoro is second, and Sanji is third, then is Zoro supposed to be closer to Luffy, closer to Sanji, or right in the middle? But before we get into that, make sure to hit that subscribe button for more One Piece content like this. So before I get into the retrospective, I'm just going to come out and say what my opinion is, and then we're going to go through the series and see if that makes sense. My opinion is, and you're not going to like this, but I think Oda has always made it clear that there is a gap between Luffy and Sanji, that Zoro is somewhere in the middle of that gap, but the point is that it is always meant to be ambiguous where exactly Zoro is. I do not think that Oda himself concretely thinks that Zoro is neck and neck with Sanji, or that Zoro is neck and neck with Luffy, or that Zoro is even right in the middle. I think that a huge part of the reason that there is so much debate regarding Zoro and Sanji is specifically because it feels like, yes, there are moments in the series you can point to where it seems like Oda is portraying Zoro on Luffy's level, and yes, there are moments you can point to in the series where it seems like Oda is portraying Zoro and Sanji on the same level. But I don't think it's as simple as Oda is inconsistent, or even that the gaps are necessarily even fluctuating over time. I think it's a little more deliberate than that, and that it fits with the concepts of the characters. So Luffy is of course the star of the show. He will always get the biggest fights and the best feats. However, a large part of the appeal of Zoro is that even though Zoro is not the number one guy, and he's completely comfortable with not being the number one guy, the fact is that in moments when it really comes down to it, he can step up and be as extraordinary as Luffy. In moments, he is right there to pick up for Luffy or stand in his place. The fact that we get glimpses of the notion that Zoro may be able to stand shoulder to shoulder with Luffy, even though he normally chooses to stand behind him, is a large part of what makes Zoro so cool. But then with Sanji, a huge appeal of his character is that unlike Luffy and Zoro, he is not a meathead. He is not obsessively driven to get stronger. That's not a defining goal of his character. His role is technically just the ship's cook, who prioritizes just making some good food over anything else, but the reality is that even though he's just the cook, even though he's not constantly fighting like Luffy, or constantly training like Zoro, even though his goals and ambition are not the same as theirs, even though by all rights Sanji should just be a more regular guy, Sanji's randomly absurdly strong. He's the guy that goes under the radar so often, he's the guy that the enemy may miss out on, or underestimate. He's not really written like Luffy and Zoro, yet he can still hang with them, despite that. At the end of the day, he's right there with them, he's part of that trio. So what I'm saying is that overall, considering how Oda likes to write their characters, I think Oda doesn't have a hard cap or set idea of what the gaps are between Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji, but rather it's more about what the characters can do. I think Oda may have Sanji regularly, often get the short end of the stick and have some bad showings throughout the series, but at the same time, at Sanji's best moments, he can be right up there with Luffy and Zoro, and specifically be shown to be just as valuable as Luffy's left hand as Zoro is as Luffy's right hand. In the same way, I think Oda usually won't portray Zoro as Luffy's equal. I think it's much more common that you see, Zoro and Sanji bickering over their rivalry or who's stronger, but at the same time, when push comes to shove, Zoro can seem comparable to Luffy in strength. Zoro can get Luffy-esque portrayal. So I don't think Oda's ever going to be outright like, Zoro and Sanji are equal, or Luffy and Zoro are equal. I think it's going to vary from time to time. I think Oda simply prefers the ambiguity. You can look at certain parts of the series and say Sanji can be equal to Zoro, but then you can look at other parts of the series and say Zoro can be equal to Luffy. Basically, I would describe it as Luffy's portrayal will always be greater than or equal to Zoro, and Zoro's portrayal will always be greater than or equal to Sanji. And even though it's pretty clear Luffy is stronger than Sanji, the gaps don't really need to be any more clear-cut than this general idea. You may disagree, but I definitely think the series works a lot better this way, where we understand the hierarchy, but there's enough room for interpretation that you can argue in favor of your favorite character without being an open and shut case. So all that being said, let's look back at the series from the start, and obviously this will be, my opinions on lots of moments and scenes, on what the gaps between Zoro and Sanji look like. And I will try to leave out my bias, but you can let me know below if you think I did a good job or not. So the first arc that Zoro and Sanji are featured together is Arlong Park, where Zoro goes into the arc heavily injured. This is maybe the worst or second worst state we've ever seen Zoro in. He and Sanji both beat opponents who seem to be of similar strength. and really, they're both a lot stronger than their opponents. Zoro just struggles a bit because of his injuries, and Sanji struggles just a little bit because he's underwater. The main thing is that both Zoro and Sanji then get slapped around by Arlong. However, during this scene, Oda definitely goes out of his way to make a big deal out of the fact that Zoro is severely injured right now, and Arlong himself is in shock that Zoro is even able to fight. So basically, Oda stresses the point that Zoro is extremely handicapped here, leaving the idea of what a healthy Zoro versus Arlong would look like up to interpretation. So right off the bat, Oda's building in ambiguity as to whether or not Zoro could pull off what Luffy later pulls off in defeating Arlong. However, you also have to note that Sanji probably isn't 100% here either, as Sanji did take some serious hits during his fight with Kurobi. The only difference is that Oda doesn't go out of his way to really stress that Sanji is now handicapped against Arlong, like he does with Zoro. Basically meaning that from the first arc, I think the dynamic that I'm talking about is in full effect, with Luffy as the strongest, Sanji as the third, and Zoro somewhat ambiguously in the middle. Against Arlong, we see that yes, Luffy is the star, he does what Zoro and Sanji couldn't, and we see that Zoro and Sanji equally struggle against Arlong. You could say that Zoro and Sanji are being portrayed as equal and below Luffy. However, it's also clear that Oda is building in heavy ambiguity as to what Zoro could do, potentially at full strength. And then the reader can also decide themselves how much weight to put into Sanji's injuries that aren't played up much, but we also do know exist. So, after that, we get two arcs that really seemingly sum up the Zoro and Sanji arguments in a nutshell. First, we get Whiskey Peak. That clearly shows Luffy and Zoro as briefly equal in a fight. And yes, it was a fight over something minor, but the portrayal of the scene definitely felt like it was very serious intent from both ends. I'm sure they didn't actually want to kill each other, but I do think they were at the very least serious about finding out who was stronger. So, it should be settled, right? It's Luffy and Zoro at the top, and then Sanji below. But then right after that, we get Little Garden, with Zoro and Sanji competing and then tying in a hunting contest. You can say it's just a hunting contest, but the context matters a lot, as this contest was meant to directly parallel the competition of Dory and Broggy, who themselves spent 100 years trying to figure out who was stronger after tying in a hunting contest. The clear portrayal here is that this was an equal matchup between Zoro and Sanji, but that of course goes against the arc right before that implied it was Luffy and Zoro that was the equal matchup. To me, all that pretty clearly fits with my belief that Oda simply doesn't want to set it in stone either way. After that, of course, we get to Alabasta and Zoro beats Mr. 1, Sanji beats Mr. 2, and Luffy beats Crocodile. Zoro had a lot more difficulty beating Mr. 1 than Sanji did beating Mr. 2, but at the same time there's probably no way Sanji could have beaten Mr. 1, but Zoro definitely couldn't have beaten Crocodile. But you could even argue that, hey, maybe Luffy couldn't have beaten Mr. 1 at that time because it's a bad matchup for Luffy or something. I don't have much to say on Alabasta, though it's important to note that Luffy and Zoro are the only ones who got bounties there. That's something consistent Oda does throughout the series, in that he often elevates Zoro in importance above Sanji frequently, such as beyond those bounties, Oda made Luffy and Zoro supernovas and part of the worst generation without having Sanji ever get that elite status. However, at the same time, that also just fits Sanji's MO, in that he is often supposed to go under the radar, and that's where he excels. Now I'll also add that Oda is often happy making Sanji look bad, make him the butt of jokes, or have somewhat random bad showings throughout the series. It's very common for a random arc to show Zoro looking kinda cool and have Sanji, maybe not so much. If Oda wants to establish that a new character like Cricket is somewhat strong, then he's going to have Sanji fight him, for example, even if it doesn't really make Sanji look good. I would say the point in the series that looked most like Oda was playing up Luffy and Zoro being close to each other with a big gap over Sanji was the period between Alabasta and Enies Lobby. During Skypiea, we saw Luffy and Wiper were equals, and later we even saw Zoro and Wiper go roughly even. Not to mention Sanji didn't actually beat anyone by himself this arc, and had trouble with Luffy against Satori, whereas Zoro could beat Ohm by himself. You could argue this is the result of matchups, but I'm just saying what happened. Not to mention, after this arc, we had Zoro perform comparably to Sanji during the Groggy Monsters fight, even though Zoro didn't have his swords. We still regularly get the portrayal that Zoro and Sanji are Luffy's right and left-hand men. They fight the Groggy Monsters as a team, while Luffy fights the boss by himself. Zoro and Sanji back Luffy up, while he takes on Aokiji, and so on. But I think you could definitely make the argument that Sanji didn't really seem equal to Zoro for a long while during this middle portion of the pre-time skip. That definitely continued through the Water 7 train battles, with Luffy and Zoro getting some great moments together, looking like equals, Zoro getting lots of hype moments like cutting the train and taking out T-Bone. Sanji, on the other hand, was honestly being outshone by Franky at this point, with Franky overall looking more impressive during the sea train fights. At this point in time, it seemed way more like Luffy and Zoro are close to equals, and Sanji is further behind. However, after that we got the Enies Lobby battles, and we got factual power levels with Doriki to tell us what the gaps were. Zoro and Sanji fought Kaku and Jaibura, who themselves were factually practically equal. Zoro's opponent was slightly stronger, but Zoro also struggled slightly harder, and the main point is that they were both way behind Luffy's opponent Lucci, who was seemingly twice as strong as Kaku or Jaibura. So at this point, you could say that, okay, never mind, forget all that we got between Alabasta and this point. It seems like Oda is making it clear that Luffy is at the top, and then Zoro and Sanji are close to each other, far below him, and that's the way that the gaps are supposed to be, right? So one might now say that, okay, that means that the gaps fluctuate. Before, it seemed like it's Luffy and Zoro here, and then Sanji down here. Now it seems like it's Luffy up here, and Zoro and Sanji down here. I'm saying that no, I still don't think that the gaps ever actually changed that much, and that was always meant to be Luffy, Sanji, Zoro somewhere in the middle. And let me explain why that's the case even with this new information we got from Enies Lobby. The weirdly popular take that I see people say is that when Luffy got gears, Oda moved him ahead of the other two. However, I don't think that's the case because what nobody brings up is that Luffy had a way harder fight against Lucci than Zoro or Sanji did against their opponents. The fact is, Zoro and Sanji pretty much one-shotted their opponents after they busted out their power-ups. Just because we got to see Luffy use Gear Second extensively against Lucci doesn't mean that Zoro or Sanji couldn't have done close to as well against Lucci if they had used Ashura or Diablo Jambe against him. For example, Blueno is much weaker than Kaku and Jaibura. Once Luffy went Gear Second, he stomped Blueno. But Zoro and Sanji pretty much did the exact same thing to Kaku and Jaibura once they used their respective power-ups, and these opponents are much stronger than Blueno. That's just something to think about when people say that Luffy got way stronger than Zoro and Sanji once he got gears. That just seems extremely unfounded to me, because Zoro and Sanji got huge power-ups too. They just didn't get to showcase them for an extended period of time against a strong opponent like Lucci, because they actually Blueno'd their own opponents so fast with their own power-ups. If anything, the only time we got to see all three of the Monster Trio going all out with their respective power-ups pre-time skip against one common opponent was the Pacifista, and as far as I can tell, they all did close to the same. I don't think Luffy was portrayed as being head and shoulders above them at this point in time. I saw it more so as Luffy got the final blow, but they could each individually damage the Pacifista before that. But I'm getting ahead of myself and going off on a bit of a tangent. The focus is still on Zoro and Sanji, and my point is that during Enies Lobby, that is the time that it seemed like you could now most concretely make the case that Zoro and Sanji are pretty much equals with Luffy far ahead. I'm just arguing that they were also both closer to Luffy at that point in time than people think, meaning that I don't think that the gaps, whatever the gaps are, really ever changed. I think the dynamic stayed constant all the time, that Luffy is the strongest, Sanji is third, and Zoro is ambiguously in the middle. How close they all are, that's up for debate. I think that's reinforced in Thriller Bark, where Zoro and Sanji both do similarly well against oars. You could actually argue that Sanji had the best feat against oars, but at the end of the arc, Zoro was literally able to take on all of Luffy's pain plus his own. So Zoro had by far the most impressive moment of the arc out of any of the Straw Hats, including Luffy. And then of course the following Pacifista battle, I already went over, and then we had the time skip. So recapping the pre-time skip. I definitely feel like Zoro and Sanji were regularly grouped together very often or put on the same level, but then there are also many moments throughout where it definitely felt like Zoro was portrayed as comparable to Luffy. That feeling definitely continued through the start of the post-time skip, with small moments from the start where we see Zoro and Sanji regularly doing things together, taking out the Pacifista together, taking out Kraken tentacles before Luffy does the big finish, taking out these henchmen before Luffy takes on Hori, so on and so forth. However, as the time skip progressed, yeah, I definitely think that Sanji has gotten a lot more moments where he seemed to struggle, such as against Virgo, such as against Doflamingo, etc. On the other hand, Zoro's moments have been much more ambiguous. He wasn't immediately defeated even by Fujitora, and even though Zoro obviously would have lost if that fight had gone on, I'd say it looked pretty good for him, at least in the context that he could at least counterattack an Admiral's attack. And then throughout Wano, we've just generally got a lot more good showings for Zoro, fighting other Supernova left and right, and being shown to be at least roughly on par with everyone he's gone up against. Again, with that ambiguous placing of Zoro, I think most people agree that Zoro hasn't really shown us his upper limit yet, or even come up against a clear wall where he has had to go all out and show us how strong he is. And the Zoro-Luffy dynamic has definitely been played up throughout Wano, and especially during this Onigashima raid. But at the same time, Luffy has been going above and beyond with crazy feats and wins throughout the New World, beating Doflamingo, Cracker, Katakuri. So what are the gaps between Luffy, Zoro, and Sanji at the moment? Well, as a reminder, the last semi-decent Zoro-Sanji comparison we had was both of them against X-Drake, where Sanji didn't look great, but it's not like he lost, and it was very quick, and Zoro looked equal, roughly, but it's not like he was going all out. So all that is to say that right now, I still think we've got the same dynamic as ever, with Luffy clearly having a very high ceiling, then Sanji somewhere below him, we don't know how far off, and then Zoro's current strength being clearly ambiguously somewhere in this range. Maybe Zoro's full strength is near Luffy's now that he has Enma. Maybe it's closer to Sanji now that Sanji has a raid suit, so Sanji also got a buff. Overall, I think all three of them are going to get great showings by the end of the Wano War, with all three of them getting even more big buffs by the end of it. But at the end of the day, I think the dynamic is going to be the same as always. The gaps might feel different at certain times, maybe for a while it definitely might seem like Zoro and Sanji are being portrayed as equal or about the same level, and Luffy's solidly ahead, like at the start of the post-time skip. Maybe at times it'll seem like Zoro could be as strong as Luffy, as some people feel he may be now, with all this talk of Zoro cutting Kaido and joining in that fight. But the point is that long term, over the general overarching trend of the series, this stuff is meant to be more nebulous in my opinion. I think the main dynamic Oda likes is simply Luffy at the top, Sanji third, and Zoro ambiguously somewhere in the middle, with the gaps somewhat hazy and unclear. Everything else is just momentary shifts in perception based on recent events that will always average out over time with future events. If you enjoyed this video, then definitely like, comment, and subscribe, and you can support me on Patreon to get my extended thoughts on this topic and all future topics.